You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 367, recorded on Monday, April 19th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week on the bonus episode, we're talking about the early transatlantic telegraph cables of the 1850s and 1860s, which required multiple costly attempts over a decade to succeed permanently beyond a demonstration. This development revolutionized communications, politics, and trade between North America and Europe during the Second Industrial Revolution. The defining feature of transatlantic relations from the late 15th century until the 19th century was the extreme time delays in communication of vital urgent information and the same delays for transportation back and forth of goods, resources, workers, and soldiers. During those same centuries, much of financial capitalism around loans, bills of exchange, and insurance arose to try to deal with the uncertainties across time and space, as part of the same process occurring inside the overland economy of the European interior and then the American interior. The transatlantic delays were significantly shortened with the advent of steam-assisted sail-powered shipping and screw propellers in the 1820s and 1830s, but even in the 1860s, it still often took more than 10 days to travel from London to the US or Canadian East Coast, with mail ships typically covering the distance in 7 to 15 days, depending on weather conditions and destinations. By contrast, the laying of undersea telegraph cables before and after the American Civil War, initially short-lived and then permanent, to link the British Isles to the British North American territories in present-day Canada, shortened communication times to the same day. While it still took time to move goods or people across the ocean, information could travel immediately. To minimize wasted response time in moving those goods or people to take advantage of the most favorable price opportunities or to arrive to deal with crises. These undersea telegraph cables were the only game in town for instant communication across the ocean until the development of transatlantic wireless radio telegraphy in 1901 by Marconi, and they remained a dominant mode until their replacement by undersea telephone cables almost a century later. So our major source for this episode is going to be the website Atlantic-cable.com. This is an incredible Web 1.0 website which recently celebrated its 21st anniversary and is regularly updated with information on historical undersea cables all over the world, and was updated this month as we were preparing for this episode. So it's not an out-of-date website, it's still currently active. They've never updated the look and feel of it, and we think that's great. This gets a 5-star recommendation from all of us here at Arsenal for Democracy. We keep passing the link around and showing everyone what a cool website this is. And it has just incredible levels of detail, tons of primary source documents and things like that. So, using that website and various other sources, let's talk about the history of the transatlantic telegraph cable. People had been trying to figure out the feasibility of an undersea telegraph cable across the Atlantic since about 1840, and they had linked shorter undersea distances like England and France by 1850. The mid-1850s saw the linking together of what are now the Atlantic provinces of Canada with mainland North America via short undersea cables. British entrepreneurs and American entrepreneurs, in partnership with the British Navy and the U.S. Navy, were determined to link together Ireland and Newfoundland by a telegraph cable. They set about attempting this from 1857 to 1866, despite very difficult ocean floor terrain and rough weather conditions in the North Atlantic. Now, there were several failed attempts, including one that sort of succeeded but isn't generally regarded to be the first, at least permanent, success, starting in 1857. So in 1857, less than 400 nautical miles were laid of cable by the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company before failure. The company would eventually be absorbed in 1870 by another company that actually succeeded briefly in 1858 and then permanently succeeded in 1866. In 1858, as I said, there was a short-lived successful demonstration connecting Ireland to Newfoundland for 3 weeks, and then intermittently thereafter for a combined total of less than 2 months of operation before it shorted out. This 1858 project was the project of a young, rich, retired Massachusetts paper mill supply chain and paper wholesale magnate, Cyrus W. Field, and his Atlantic Telegraph Company. That company would emerge after its eventual success in 1866 as a near monopoly in the Atlantic called the Anglo-American Telegraph Company, investing in or merging with other countries' undersea cable laying companies, as well as their rivals in the United States and Britain. An article from 1950 on Cyrus W. Field suggests that telegraphy was a natural vertical integration step for someone in the paper industry, since paper was so heavily used for telegraph messages. But interestingly, the Wikipedia article on Cyrus W. Field makes some other points that also lend themselves to this conclusion about vertical integration. Cyrus W. Field, specifically within the paper industry, was heavily involved in selling wholesale paper volumes to printers of stocks, bonds, and tabloid newspapers, all of which seem to lend themselves to natural corporate tie-ins with the telegraph industry. And although he was retired from active management of that paper business before becoming involved in telegraphy, he still made most of his income as a passive investor in his old firm. So you can see how drumming up new business opportunities that were linked together would have helped him. Rachel, could you talk about the project specifications from the 1858 effort, which ultimately didn't last very long, but at least proved that it was theoretically feasible to do this?
So first off, there were 2,200 nautical miles of cable, and this cable was made of 7 strands of copper wire, 6 wrapped around the 7th. Number 22 BWG is the name of the assembly, covered with 3 coats of gutta percha, which was a non-conductive latex sap from British Malaya, which ended up being over-harvested to supply undersea cables, according to John Tully in the 2009 journal article, A Victorian Ecological Disaster, Imperialism, the Telegraph, and Gutta Percha. The cable also consisted of number 4 BWG. This was those copper wires wrapped in jute yarn soaked with a composition consisting of 5/12 Stockholm tar, 5/12 pitch, 1/12 boiled linseed oil, and 1/12 common beeswax. Armoring for this cable consisted of 18 strands, each strand composed of 7 of the best charcoal iron wires, 6 wrapped around the 7th, each of 22 BWG. The completed cable, as it left the machine, was dipped in a heated composition consisting of tar, pitch, and linseed oil. The cable, as part of this 1858 attempt, worked with variable results for 3 weeks, and the last complete message being received on September 1st, 1858. Attempts to revive the cable continued, and fragments of messages were received, but the last signs of life were on October 28, 1858. So all in all, the cable was abandoned less than 3 months after its inception.
Now, after the 1858 attempt, it was obviously going to be somewhat difficult after so many failures to convince more investors to go in on this and get government assistance. But the bigger problem, even though they had successfully demonstrated that this was theoretically feasible if they could come up with a more durable solution, was that the American Civil War happened not very long after that. So basically, at that point, you had to wait until after the American Civil War was over. And then eventually they had to try to get investors back together and get various government assistance from different governments and different navies to try to get this project off the ground again. And at that point, they had some advantages by the mid-1860s, which is that a lot of shorter cables had been laid in various other places, for example, connecting together places like Sardinia and Corsica and Sicily and places like that, right? These shorter distances that linked up other parts of the world. And that had at least given a bunch of these companies and a bunch of these technicians a lot more experience in the physical production of the cables to make them more durable and reliable, as well as better understanding of the laying process and so forth. But of course, it's very difficult, as we said previously, to link together Newfoundland and Ireland because you've got very challenging environment on the sea floor as well as very challenging weather environment to make these installations. So at this point in 1865, they came pretty close again, but were thwarted once more. This was by Atlantic Telegraph, and they left Ireland and got to within 600 nautical miles of Newfoundland before the cable snapped in a high wind and was presumed lost after extensive recovery attempts. Now, interestingly enough, they actually managed to recover it the next year in a stunning and very time-consuming effort involving ocean floor hooks and surface buoys, and they were able to finish that broken cable from 1865, and that became what was the second permanent operational cable, operating until 1877. But that did not happen until they had first completed a different permanent cable. The first true success became operational on July 28, 1866, after less than a month of work at sea, including 14 days from Ireland to Newfoundland, and then additional days repairing a cable connecting Newfoundland to the mainland so that they could actually make useful communications from one side of the Atlantic to the other. 4 ships were involved in this effort: the Great Eastern, the William Corey, the Albany, and the Medway, 3 of which had worked on the failed 1865 expedition the year before, also by Atlantic Telegraph, which again had also done the successful demonstration cable in 1858. The cables themselves, from 1865 into the late 1870s, were nearly always manufactured by Telcon, or the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company of London, which was actually a subsidiary of Atlantic Telegraph. And Telcon had, by this point, monopolized the various companies that were manufacturing the cables to link together the Mediterranean islands, as I alluded to earlier. So, Rachel, could you talk about the project specifications briefly on the successful 1866 first permanent cable?
Yeah, so this project included another 1,852 nautical miles of cable, and the cable consisted of 1 copper conductor, 7 strands number 18 BWG, 6 wrapped around the 7th, coated with 3 layers of Chatterton's compound, which I'm guessing is some sort of proprietary blend, and 3 layers of gutta percha, then wrapped in tarred jute. The main cable was armored with 10 number 13 BWG galvanized iron wires, each wrapped in 5 strands of white manila, shore ends 12 number 0000 BWG black iron wires, intermediate 12 number 3 BWG, second intermediate 12 number 1 BWG, third intermediate 12 number 0 BWG galvanized iron wires. The whole cable was then wrapped in jute and dipped in Brighton Clark's composition, which was a mix of hot pitch, tar, and linseed oil. And so this is very, very heavy-duty cable that's getting laid. The laying commenced on July 7th and was completed on July 27th, and this 1866 cable was later abandoned in 1872.
Yeah, as you can guess from some of the materials that go into this stuff, these were not always the most durable, long-lasting cables. Eventually, the technology was improved, but in many cases, you had, various sea creatures biting into the gutta percha insulation or worming their way through the hemp cores if they involved hemp. And so there's just various sort of like natural, degradable materials in these cables that are difficult to deal with long term. But again, this is considered to be the first permanent cable because it was in operation for more than 5 years permanently. And at that point, then they had demonstrated that this was a viable thing to do. And then other cables were installed as well. I did put in the notes that'll go up at patreon.com/Arsenal for Democracy more information on wire rope cable technology from the first industrial revolution if you're interested in reading about that, but I'm not going to get further into it. When this cable opened, the company charged a flat rate per word per nautical mile that added up to, by my calculations, about 70 cents per word over the whole length of the cable in messages in US dollars at the time. But before we get into the implications of this cable and how it transformed communication and what kind of communications were going over it, we should talk a little bit more about the cable laying process. So, Rachel, before we get into any of the implications of that 1866 cable and some of the subsequent projects that were concluded after those 2 1866 cables were completed, could you talk to us a little bit about cable laying ships like the Great Eastern that completed those first 2 cables? I mean, these were truly massive ships to be able to carry those kind of nautical mileages that you've been reading out for us.
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on one of the biggest ships, the Great Eastern. It was one of the biggest steamships in the world, which made it ideal for carrying around massive amounts of insulated telegraph cable and coal for fuel. This cable-laying pioneer worked on both the first and second permanent cables across the Atlantic, and was also one of the final steamships designed and built by one of the leading-edge early steamship innovators, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The Great Eastern served on 7 undersea cable-laying voyages, including 5 transatlantic voyages. So the Great Eastern itself was fitted with 3 tanks built to store the cable. The forward tank being 51 feet 6 inches diameter by 20 feet 6 inches deep, with a capacity of 693 nautical miles of cable. The midships tank being 58 feet 6 inches diameter by 20 feet 6 inches deep, holding 899 nautical miles of cable, and the aft tank 58 feet diameter by 20 feet 6 inches deep, holding 898 nautical miles of cable. So the total capacity was 2,490 nautical miles of cable, and the cable machinery on board had been designed by Samuel Canning and was built by Messrs. Penn and Company of Greenwich. So after the trials and tribulations associated with the 1865 cable, the cable breaking in high storms and such, the laying of the new cable went very smoothly. On 2 occasions, the cable got tangled up, and the ship had to be stopped to enable it to be sorted out. And as we said before, the laying took 14 days, and on Friday, July 27th, the Great Eastern sailed into Heart's Content. And Cyrus Field did try to send the inaugural telegram to New York, but he was unsuccessful because he found that the cable across the Cabot Strait between Cape Ray and Cape North had not been repaired. The board of the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company had decided not to go ahead with the repair, as there was no guarantee the Atlantic cable would succeed. So a steamer, the Dauntless, was chartered to take the telegrams to the mainland for onward transmission. Cyrus Field arranged for the charter of the steamer Bloodhound to carry out the repair to the cable, using some of the cable on board the Great Eastern. And later, in 1869, the Great Eastern joined a French expedition by French Atlantic Cable Company to connect Brest in the tip of Brittany to the French North Atlantic fishing island of St. Pierre off the coast of Newfoundland, which was already connected to the British North American territories. The same project in 1869 also linked Massachusetts to St. Pierre so that messages could be transmitted via the island to the European continent from the U.S. without going through Canada, Newfoundland, Ireland, and England first. The following year, or at least by 1873, French Atlantic was absorbed into the Anglo-American conglomerate to avoid competition to lower the price of transatlantic telegraph messages.
Interestingly, at the time that these projects were going on, the U.S. Capitol Dome Rotunda canopy was being painted in 1865, and although the project was not actually completed until 1866 successfully, that to this present day, that canopy painting includes an allegorical depiction of Venus and Neptune laying a transatlantic cable with a steamship, while Minerva, in another vignette, bestows technological wisdom upon inventors Ben Franklin, Robert Fulton, who's the guy credited generally at least with the river steamboat, and Samuel Morse, the inventor of the U.S. telegraph. Now, let's talk a little bit about the implications of the telegraph network finally being linked up successfully on a permanent basis in 1866. At least, there was some initial delays for a few days, I think, while they were still working on getting the linkage up from Newfoundland to the mainland coast of Canada. But the implications after that linkage was completed were pretty much revolutionary almost immediately at that point. And for this, we want to turn to a fascinating economics paper, which is titled Real Effects of Information Frictions When the States and the Kingdom Became United, published in American Economic Review in March 2018 by Claudia Steinwender. And this is a paper basically on what the price implications were and economic efficiency implications of trade information becoming not exactly real time, but about as close as you could get to real time between the New York cotton exchanges and the Liverpool cotton exchanges, so that cotton that was coming into New York from the American South could be priced at the most competitive or lucrative, depending on your perspective, prices for both interior American cotton mills turning things into textiles, as well as for transportation overseas to the huge British markets for cotton. And the reason that this paper was written was sort of to contribute to the literature in general on price uncertainty and information disparities and so forth by using this as a case study. But for our purposes, it's kind of a fascinating look at the actual implications of the telegraph cable being successfully permanently linked up across the Atlantic. And as I said at the beginning of the episode, really revolutionizing trade flows. You know, it would still take some time to move the cargoes, but at least you could reduce the disparity in prices changing suddenly 2 weeks before you actually got your goods delivered or whatever. This time you would, have at least a longer lead time, so it wasn't like a month out of date or 2 months out of date or what have you, depending on what kind of cargo you were sending and to where. So, Rachel, could you go through this, some of the excerpts from this paper to tell us about kind of the implications of this cable being completed in 1866?
Yeah, so even the abstract by itself is pretty incredible. This paper exploits a unique historical experiment to estimate how information frictions distort international trade, the establishment of the Transatlantic Telegraph in 1866. I, quoting the author, used newly collected data on cotton prices, trade, and information flows from historical newspapers and find that the average and volatility of the transatlantic price difference fell after the telegraph, while average trade flows increased and became more volatile. Using a trade model in which exporters use the latest news about a foreign market to forecast expected prices, I estimate the efficiency gains of the transatlantic telegraph to be equivalent to 8% of export value. So to put it another way, as stated in the conclusion of the paper, the reduced price distortions on cotton trade between New York and Liverpool was equivalent to abolishing a 7% trade tariff, and that's just within the narrow period immediately before and after the telegraph cable successfully opened in July 1866, to much public surprise after so many years of failure. And also from the paper, using these detailed data, I was able to document 6 reduced form findings, which are described in the paper. A, the telegraph caused increased goods market integration as the mean and volatility of the cross-Atlantic contemporaneous price differences fell. B, within the pre-telegraph period, faster steamships had a similar effect and increased market integration, whereas during the post-telegraph period, temporary technical failures of the transatlantic telegraph connection reduced market integration. C, New York prices responded strongly to news from Liverpool, while Liverpool prices reacted less strongly to news from New York. D, the telegraph reduced the mean and volatility of the difference between the current price in New York and the latest known price in Liverpool. This last finding is a new contribution to the literature on the impact of the telegraph and information frictions on financial markets, and shows that market participants did not naively arbitrage away the price difference between the current price in New York and their latest known Liverpool price, but instead took into account how outdated this information was when forming expectations about future prices. E, information frictions had real effects on trade flows and were not just a reallocation of profits across market participants because exports responded to news about Liverpool prices. To my knowledge, this paper provides the first evidence that the telegraph had real effects on exports. And F, after the telegraph, exports were on average both higher and more volatile. So these findings are robust to a number of alternative explanations, for example, transport cost variations, supply irregularities in the aftermath of the American Civil War, fluctuations within commodity points in no trade periods, change in the market structure of merchants, futures trading, and anticipation effects. So this had a very, very demonstrable effect on the volatility of the textile and cotton markets.
Now, it should be noted here that even after this cable was successfully opened permanently in 1866, and then another one was completed shortly thereafter, there were some pretty severe technological limitations. We've already talked about some of the physical problems that could cause cables to break even after they had been installed or potentially short out. But one of the biggest things, and for this I'm looking at some of the Wikipedia articles around this topic, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that due to technological limitations of sending voltages over extreme distances of wire without the boosters that would be seen in overland telegraph networks, the speed of sending messages was very slow with transoceanic telegraphy. Typically about 10 to 12 words per minute. So you're not sending, huge volumes of news back and forth every day on those early cables, certainly. For comparison, a land-based hand operator would typically send 25 to 40 words per minute, and automated machines could send anywhere from 60 to 1,000 words per minute overland, depending on what era you're talking about. And that information is from the Edison collection at Rutgers and their website. So what happened subsequently to this 1866 cable? We've already talked about some of the stuff like the French cable in 1869 and so forth. But generally speaking, as we alluded to, there was a tendency toward monopolization. It kind of makes sense. It's a very expensive and high-risk industry. Even as people started getting more competent and more experienced at installing these things, there was just a lot that could go wrong in the installation of these cables. So it was a very profitable business if you succeeded, but there was definitely a lot of risk. All of this tended toward monopolies, and the British in particular monopolized the undersea cable industry, at least in the Atlantic, as much as possible to link together all of their British imperial territories worldwide for security reasons and economic purposes. So they were, of course, adding various stretches, around Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula and over to India and to their various territories in China and Australia and New Zealand and so forth. The United States actually laid cable across the Pacific in 1902 and 1903 after the Spanish-American War by linking together its recent colonial acquisitions of Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. Subsequently, though, after a long period of undersea telegraph cables, we finally arrive at telephone cables. In 1955 and 1956, after wartime secrecy around the newly developed polyethylene plastic insulation technology had ended and could be generally used by everyone, Transatlantic Cable Number 1, or TAT-1, for telephone service was laid from Scotland to Newfoundland, with a simultaneous capacity of 35 phone calls and 22 telegraph messages. Now, it is true that a wireless radio-assisted telephone service had allowed transatlantic calls by 1927 at an exorbitant fee, but a hard wire is generally better quality, more reliable, and can carry more communications, and also, there's different interception type of risk and so forth. The TAT-1 line, installed in 1955 and 56, later is the one that carried the direct Moscow to Washington hotline. Telephone cables were in use for quite a long time until the advent of optical cables. Over a century after the first transatlantic telegraph cable, light signal-based fiber optic undersea cables began to be laid around the world for improved telephone connections in the 1980s. More advanced optical cables replaced these in the 1990s, allowing for high-speed worldwide internet connectivity by wire. And according to Newsweek in 2016, 99% of transoceanic global communications are to this day carried by optical cables on the seafloor, as opposed to satellites or other wireless means, which are much slower and less reliable than hard lines. So that brings us to the end of our examination of the profound transformative effects that were seen and felt after the advent of the permanent transatlantic telegraph cable in 1866, less so the demonstration cable that was proved in 1858 before breaking quickly. Rachel, did you have any sort of concluding thoughts on this?
I am really impressed by how, even though there's been obviously iterative improvement, these transoceanic lines are still basically in use today. They're made out of obviously more durable materials that are able to transport a lot more information, but we really are kind of standing on the shoulders of Cyrus Fields and other innovators in this field.
All right. Well, thank you for being on the bonus episode this week.
Thanks for having me.